3 minutes ago, the palace released a declaration that no royal watcher believed could ever be written. Camilla's position as Queen Consort has been terminated with immediate effect, and Princess Anne has been formally appointed to replace her beside the king. There was no gradual transition, no ceremonial farewell, and no time for private negotiation. One announcement changed the hierarchy, and behind its carefully chosen words stood a family already breaking apart. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla read the declaration twice. Her fingers tightened around the page, and when her secretary entered, she asked why nobody had warned her. The sealed statement carried King Charles's signature, the royal seal, and an exact activation time. The royal seal is the official mark proving that an order carries the monarch's authority, meaning this was no rumour, temporary punishment, or decision open to appeal. Anne received the same document at St. James's Palace and remained standing as she read it. She placed it on the table, then told her aide she had never asked to take another woman's place, yet the Princess Royal understood its weight. Queen Consort is the title given to the wife of a reigning king. But this extraordinary arrangement transferred the duties beside the monarch to his sister without ending the marriage itself. One sentence cut deeper than the rest. The change, it declared, was necessary to protect the continuity, discipline, and credibility of the crown during internal instability. That wording mattered, because the crown means more than the person wearing it. It describes the monarchy as an institution whose authority depends on public trust. Camilla heard humiliation without any warning. Anne heard duty. Charles heard the cost of a betrayal he believed he could no longer ignore. The king sat alone after authorising the release, staring at the pen he had used, while repeated knocks went unanswered. He had signed before dawn, long before his wife knew, proving the decision had been prepared in silence. Across the palace, William cancelled 2 meetings and demanded a private briefing. The Prince of Wales understood that the public statement revealed only the surface. Then came the line nobody could explain. A second sealed document existed, but the palace refused to publish it. Anne would not accept the position publicly until she learned what Camilla had done and why her brother had waited until that morning to act. But the announcement could not be understood through titles alone, because behind those titles stood 3 people bound by marriage, blood, loyalty, and a wound none of them could conceal. The palace statement reduced the crisis to a change of royal responsibility, but no official wording could contain the personal devastation underneath it. Camilla had spent years fighting for acceptance beside Charles. Anne had built her identity around service without seeking a crown, and the king now stood between the wife he had defended for decades and the sister whose loyalty had never required defending. For each of them, the announcement carried a different kind of loss. Camilla felt that loss before anyone dared explain it. She had survived years of public anger, cold palace corridors, and whispered doubts about whether she truly belonged beside the monarch. The consort role, the position held by the reigning king's spouse, carrying ceremonial duties but no independent sovereign power, had become proof that the institution had finally accepted her. Now that proof had vanished in a single morning. Anne felt no victory. She had earned respect through decades of difficult engagements, military associations, and service carried out without demanding affection in return. That was why palace officials believed she could assume immediate ceremonial authority without causing further chaos. Yet, in a closed meeting, the Princess Royal told William that duty could not erase the cruelty of replacing someone within her own family. He heard anger in her voice, not ambition. Charles remembered something worse. Years earlier, he had promised his wife privately that she would never again be left alone before public judgment. Now his own signature had broken that promise. The king was holding an old photograph of himself and his sister as children when William entered the study, and the image revealed what his silence would not. Trust between them had begun long before Camilla entered royal life. Camilla removed the diamond brooch prepared for that evening and placed it inside its case. She told her aide that the palace had not changed her schedule. It had erased her future. Her words were recorded in the aide's written account, preserving the moment long after the room fell silent. William pressed his father for the truth. The monarch said Anne had been chosen because she commanded respect across the family, the armed forces, and the palace staff. But he still refused to explain why everything had happened so immediately. Then the private memorandum surfaced. A memorandum is an internal written record used to explain decisions and responsibilities. It showed that Camilla had attempted to expand the consort's office, placing several royal functions beneath advisors personally loyal to her. Anne refused to wear any consort insignia, the badges and symbols marking the role, until she heard Camilla's account face to face. William finally revealed that the crisis had begun during one specific ceremony 3 weeks earlier. when the Queen Consort issued an instruction that directly contradicted the king. And when William named the ceremony, Charles finally looked up, because everyone in that room knew it had been the moment from which there was no return. 3 weeks before the palace announcement, the royal family gathered for what should have been a controlled ceremony of unity. Instead, one instruction delivered in a guarded corridor created a rupture that could no longer be hidden. Camilla believed she was protecting the future of her office. Anne believed the Crown's authority had been challenged. Charles attempted to contain the dispute privately, but by the end of that evening, a written warning was already being prepared. Anne noticed the change minutes before the royal service of continuity began at Windsor Castle. The ceremony required senior family members to sign a symbolic pledge defining their responsibilities during the king's reign, making its order more than decoration. She lifted the revised seating card, studied it without speaking, then asked the waiting official who had authorised her name to be moved. Camilla answered before anyone else could. She drew the Princess Royal into the adjoining corridor and insisted that the monarchy could not function while the king's wife remained beneath his sister in the final order of precedence. That order is the formal ranking that decides where royals stand, sit, and appear during official duties. The Queen Consort argued that her office needed visible authority if palace staff were expected to obey it. Anne did not raise her voice. She told Camilla that precedence was not a reward for personal acceptance, but a discipline protecting the structure of the crown. The monarch's sister warned that changing it without written approval crossed a dangerous line, because it allowed one household to speak as though it carried sovereign authority. Charles arrived as the confrontation ended. He opened the ceremonial folder, found the replacement page, and tore it free. The king ordered the original arrangement restored before anyone entered the chamber. When his wife accused him of weakening her publicly, he answered that she had weakened herself by issuing a command in his name without permission. The damage had already spread. That evening, the keeper of the Privy Records submitted a breach memorandum, an internal report documenting conduct that may violate royal procedure, and recommended an immediate review of the consort's powers. William later learned through that written record that Windsor was not an isolated incident. 3 earlier instructions had redirected staff appointments, patronage announcements, and access privileges toward Camilla's private office. Anne still urged her brother not to humiliate his wife before the public. She believed the family could survive a private correction, but Charles discovered the altered ceremonial document had already reached several senior officials. Silence was no longer protection, it had become permission. The monarch summoned Camilla for a final confrontation. His sister waited nearby while an unsigned removal order rested on the desk between loyalty and consequence. By the time Camilla entered that room, the argument was no longer about a seating card. It was about whether the crown still answered to one sovereign voice. There were no cameras, no private secretaries, and no carefully rehearsed smiles when Camilla entered the king's study. Charles stood behind his desk with the Windsor Memorandum open before him. Anne waited near the fireplace, not as an arrival, but as the witness Camilla least wanted present. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Charles pushed the altered ceremony page across the desk and asked his wife one question. "Did you authorise this?" Camilla admitted it. She said palace officials had continued treating her office as decorative when it was meant to support the reign at its centre. The Windsor Precedence document, the formal paper setting the order in which senior royals appear and perform duties, had seemed to her like proof that nothing had truly changed. She claimed she had acted to protect the authority expected of the king's wife. Anne stepped forward before Charles could answer. She told the Queen Consort that respect could not be manufactured by moving names across a page. The Princess Royal said Camilla had knowingly used the monarch's authority without permission, then warned that such power could not be borrowed through marriage. Camilla turned on her. She accused Anne of building a silent alliance with William, one designed to control Charles whenever he became emotionally uncertain. The accusation landed hard. The king struck the desk once with his palm, shocking both women into silence. He declared that neither his wife nor his sister would speak as though he had already lost command of the crown. Charles opened another folder. 3 additional directives carried Camilla's approval marks, including a proposal to replace senior household officials with advisors selected by her private secretary. A royal household is the staff structure supporting official duties, schedules, communications, and palace administration. Those appointments mattered because controlling them meant controlling which voices reached the sovereign first. Camilla insisted every change had been designed to protect him from exhaustion. The monarch asked why every protection she proposed also increased her own control. Anne moved toward the door, prepared to leave the couple alone, but her brother ordered her to remain. The decision, he said, now concerned the institution, not merely the marriage. Camilla finally broke. She asked whether decades of loyalty could truly be erased by one ceremony and several instructions. Charles answered that the number did not matter. What mattered was the moment affection became permission to act in the sovereign's name. The king rotated the unsigned order toward her. She saw Anne's name beneath the words, immediate assumption of consort duties, and slowly pushed her chair away. Before he could sign, William arrived carrying a file that proved the struggle had already reached preparations for the next reign. The marriage had reached its breaking point, but William's file would transform a private breach of trust into a threat against the monarchy's future. William entered carrying no dramatic proclamation, only a thin, dark folder sealed by the office of the Prince of Wales. Yet Charles recognised its significance immediately. The documents inside concerned the transition to the next reign, plans that were not supposed to be altered without the heir's approval. Camilla watched William place the folder beside the removal order, and for the first time that morning, her anger gave way to fear. Someone had gone further than anyone knew. William opened the file carefully. As heir, he held responsibility for planning the future royal household, meaning the staff, duties, residences, and official structure that would support his reign. He could not remove the king's consort while Charles remained sovereign, but the prince could prevent unauthorised plans from controlling what came after. That made his cooperation essential. Without it, the present crisis could poison the succession itself. Camilla stared as he revealed a draft transition framework. The document laid out how authority would pass from one reign to the next. Yet several clauses had been altered. Her advisors had attempted to secure permanent positions and continuing access after Charles's reign ended. One section would have allowed the former consort's private office to influence royal residences, charitable funds, and selected archives during William's future rule. Camilla denied approving it. She demanded that her former private secretary be summoned immediately, and the force in her voice revealed something unsettling. Even she might not know how far her staff had pushed the plan. William remained controlled, but the hurt beneath his words was impossible to miss. He told her the framework treated his future household like territory to be divided, before he had even inherited responsibility for it. Anne examined the signatures and recognised a court advisor she had previously warned Charles about. A court advisor is a senior official who helps guide royal decisions and communications, and this one had been building competing channels of influence for months. The Princess Royal reminded her brother that divided authority always begins quietly. Through access, appointments, and documents no one believes will matter until they do. Charles read the final page, closed his eyes, and removed his spectacles. The king admitted that protecting Camilla from criticism may have stopped him from seeing what had grown around her. William then asked the question no husband wanted to hear. Was he deciding under pressure, or was he acting as sovereign and accepting responsibility? The monarch took the pen and signed. He told Anne her appointment was not a reward, but an emergency obligation to restore confidence. She placed her hand over the order and demanded written limits on her own authority before accepting it. The ink had barely dried when a knock sounded at the door, carrying the first visible proof that Camilla's royal life had already begun to disappear. Royal power rarely vanishes with raised voices. It disappears through changed schedules, collected keys, removed names, and doors that no longer open. Before Camilla left the king's study, her chief equerry was informed that her engagements had been suspended. The consort's red dispatch boxes were recalled. Her security designation was revised. Then an aide entered carrying a velvet tray and asked for the insignia that identified her household authority. Camilla looked at Charles, but he could not meet her eyes. When another official asked for it, Camilla closed her hand around the access card. The card controlled entry to consort offices, private briefings, and restricted palace rooms, making it a symbol of authority rather than a simple pass. She said Charles had given it to her on the morning of the coronation. The king answered quietly that it represented an office, not their marriage. She returned it, then told him the palace had made those two things impossible to separate. The order moved quickly. Anne received temporary command over ceremonial coordination, household representation, and consort duties, while staff followed a timed protocol to change stationery, seating plans, briefing access, and engagement approvals before the evening bulletin. A protocol is a formal set of steps officials must follow during sensitive royal changes. Every altered page mattered, because confusion could suggest the monarchy no longer controlled its own decisions. Anne entered the consort office and found Camilla's unfinished speech still resting on the desk. The Princess Royal folded it carefully and asked that it be delivered privately rather than discarded. She understood that taking over a role did not give her permission to erase the woman who had occupied it. William issued the same warning to staff. The prince ordered them to treat Camilla with dignity, saying humiliation would turn an institutional correction into personal cruelty. Yet the machinery continued. A senior courtier removed her nameplate from the briefing room as she passed at the far end of the corridor, and the sound of metal striking the table reached her before anyone could hide it. Camilla's closest aides were suspended pending review, including the advisor connected to the transition framework. Within minutes, the network that had once surrounded her disappeared. Charles allowed his wife to retain her private residence and personal style, meaning the form of address she could still use socially, proving he intended to remove power without destroying their private bond. Camilla refused the private exit. She walked through the main corridor with her head raised as staff members fell silent. Anne received the first dispatch box but left it unopened. She would not begin until she had spoken to her predecessor without Charles, William, lawyers, or courtiers present. Hours after the palace divided their positions, Anne crossed the corridor alone to discover whether anything personal could survive what the crown had done. Anne entered without aids, folders, or ceremonial insignia. Camilla was seated beside an untouched cup of tea, still wearing the clothes chosen for an engagement she would never attend. For once, neither woman had an official beside her to soften the words. Anne closed the door and remained standing. Camilla asked whether she had come to inspect what was left. Anne answered that she had come because the crown had spoken, but the family had not. Anne said she had never wanted the consort role and would hold it only as long as stability required. The position meant supporting the reigning monarch through ceremonial and public duties, but she refused to treat it as a prize. She told Camilla that no secretary would record their words, no lawyer would shape them, and Charles would not enter to rescue either woman from the truth. Camilla admitted authorising the Windsor change. She feared becoming powerless as the king's health, energy, and public confidence faced growing pressure. After years of being judged as an outsider, every limit placed on her office felt like proof that the family still expected her to disappear. The Queen Consort said fear had followed her into every room, even after the crown appeared to offer acceptance. Anne listened, but she did not surrender the point. She said fear could explain the decision without excusing it. Using Charles's name to overrule the structure he had sworn to protect crossed a line that affection could not erase. When Camilla asked whether she believed her love for him had ever been real, the Princess Royal answered that love was not in question. The danger began when love became justification for control. Anne placed the unfinished speech on the table. She had refused to let palace staff destroy it because losing authority should not mean losing dignity. Camilla's anger softened. She confessed that advisors had warned her. The former consort removed the brooch from her dress and offered it across the table. Anne refused to take it. The symbol belonged to the crown, she said, and must be surrendered formally, not passed between wounded relatives. Camilla then asked her to protect Charles from the loneliness his decision would create. Anne replied that she would protect the monarch, but Camilla must decide whether she could still protect the man. Inside the room, two women had finally spoken honestly. Outside, their private pain was becoming the most public royal rupture in a generation. By late afternoon, the announcement was no longer confined to palace corridors. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Newspapers rebuilt their front pages within minutes. Some people saw Anne's appointment as the restoration of duty. Others saw Camilla's removal as a brutal public rejection after years of service. Yet one image captured the national mood more powerfully than any commentator. Two women at the palace gates holding signs that defended opposite sides, standing silently beside each other. Rain fell steadily as hundreds gathered beneath umbrellas, listening while one broadcaster read the declaration aloud from a phone. The palace insisted the change represented continuity, meaning the crown's work would continue without delay despite the crisis. Yet replacing a living consort had no modern parallel, and that alone ensured the story crossed borders within minutes. One newspaper rebuilt its front page in black and gold beneath the headline, "The King Chooses Duty." Anne's formal portrait dominated the page, while a smaller image showed Camilla leaving the palace. A national broadcaster called it the moment family loyalty collided with sovereign responsibility, and those words instantly divided the debate between sympathy and judgment. Camilla watched alone until a commentator described her removal as inevitable. She switched off the television before the sentence ended. Hearing strangers reduce decades of struggle, acceptance, and service to a single conclusion wounded her more deeply than the official order had done. Anne arrived at Clarence House to meet Charles before their first appearance together. The residence serves as one of the King's official London homes, but that afternoon it felt less like a royal base than a place of reckoning. She noticed his hands trembling as he fastened his cufflinks and told him that courage did not make a decision painless. The monarch answered that pain was no excuse for delay. William released a brief written statement supporting his father's authority while thanking Camilla for her service. The prince understood the balance required to protect the institution without publicly destroying the woman who had stood beside it. Public anger softened further when officials confirmed she would retain her private residence, personal dignity, and family protection. Then the suspended advisor accepted responsibility through a documented account for drafting the most aggressive transition clauses. The admission showed that Camilla had approved recklessly, but it weakened claims of a complete personal conspiracy. Anne demanded that clear limits on her new office be published before her first duty. The decision reassured those who feared unchecked power had merely changed hands. By morning, she would stand beside Charles at a national service. Camilla would also be present privately, beyond the formal procession, but not beyond the consequences. The world had chosen its headlines, but the monarchy's true verdict would be delivered the next morning through three people who could no longer hide behind ceremony. The following morning, Charles entered the national service with Anne beside him, not as a triumphant replacement, but as the sister carrying a burden he could no longer carry alone. Camilla did not attend. She watched privately as the congregation rose, and when Anne paused before taking her place, the meaning of the crisis became unmistakable. This was not a victory over one woman. It was a public reckoning with power, trust, love, and duty. Anne wore no newly assigned jewels and asked officials to keep every announcement focused on the king. Her new position as Queen Consort, the royal role supporting a reigning monarch through ceremonial and public responsibilities, came with authority, but she refused to display it as personal triumph. Charles hesitated at the entrance. She offered her arm quietly, reminding everyone that she stood there to steady her brother, not to replace his command. Camilla watched from her private residence with the unfinished speech beside her. Grief remained, sharp and humiliating, yet relief had begun to appear beneath it. The palace had stopped the struggle before power consumed the marriage completely. For the first time, she understood that losing the office might be the only way to preserve what remained between them. Charles visited her after the service without aids. He left his royal briefing folder outside, signalling that he entered as a husband rather than the sovereign who had dismissed her. Camilla accepted responsibility for approving decisions she had not fully examined. She admitted that fear of exclusion had driven her toward powers the consort was never meant to possess. Charles did not allow himself innocence. He confessed that his refusal to challenge her earlier had allowed resentment and ambitious advisors to grow. The king understood that the removal order judged his delay as much as her actions. Love had made him protective, but protection without accountability had become permission. Anne formally accepted the role under written limits. She could not alter succession planning, household authority, precedents, or royal appointments without sovereign approval. William endorsed those restrictions, declaring through an official statement that her service would rest on transparency and restraint rather than private influence. The investigation dismissed the most ambitious advisors, cleared junior staff who had merely followed instructions, and cancelled every clause designed to shape William's future reign. Camilla remained part of Charles's private life, but surrendered all formal consort power. Her dignity survived, though her authority did not. Anne accepted without celebration. Camilla endured without destruction. Charles preserved the monarchy, but lost the illusion that affection and duty could always share the same space without conflict. Each surrendered something: power, resentment, certainty, or pride. And that sacrifice became the price of survival. And so the palace announcement entered history not as Anne's victory or Camilla's defeat, but as the morning the crown chose responsibility over comfort and survived because no one was permitted to stand above it. But the story did not end with a signed order, a folded speech, or a quiet visit between two women who had never truly been friends. The days that followed the announcement carried their own weight, slower and more complicated than the crisis itself, because the palace had resolved a question of authority while leaving every question of trust entirely unanswered. Charles rose before dawn on the second morning. He did not summon an aide, request a briefing, or open the folders stacked beside his chair. Instead, he walked the length of the East Corridor alone, passing portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices, and he understood for the first time that history would not remember the pain behind his decision. It would remember only whether the institution survived it. That thought neither comforted nor hardened him. It simply reminded him of the distance between the man he was and the role he was required to perform. Anne began her duties without ceremony. She attended the first briefing in the consort office and found the room still arranged as Camilla had left it. She did not request changes, she worked around them. Palace staff watched carefully, uncertain whether her restraint reflected wisdom or reluctance, and found that it reflected both equally. She signed no letters using the consort title until the written limits on her authority had been formally published and distributed to every senior official. Only then did she allow her name to appear beneath the seal. William worked quietly in the background, as he had always preferred. He reviewed the investigation's findings personally, cross-referencing each dismissed clause against his own transition plans to ensure nothing harmful remained embedded in the framework. His staff described him as methodical and unhurried during those days, which told those who knew him that he was, in fact, deeply unsettled. The file he had carried into his father's study had revealed something William had not fully prepared himself to confront, that the protection of his future reign had already been treated as a prize to be negotiated before he had even assumed responsibility for it. Camilla, meanwhile, moved through her private residence with a quietness that those around her found harder to witness than anger would have been. She answered letters personally, without using official stationery. She declined the first 3 interview requests within hours of each arriving. She took long walks in the early evening when the grounds were empty, and her protection officer noted in his daily log that she never once asked to alter her route to avoid being seen. She walked where she had always walked, as though surrendering an office did not require surrendering a self. The public remained divided, as publics always do when an institution forces them to choose between sympathy and principle. Those who had never accepted Camilla found confirmation in the announcement. Those who had watched her earn her place over decades found something closer to grief. Letters arrived at the palace in volumes not seen since the early years of the reign, some addressed to Charles, some to Anne, and a surprising number addressed to Camilla directly, from ordinary people who had watched the news and understood, perhaps more clearly than the palace expected, that power and dignity are not the same thing, and that losing one does not require losing the other. One letter arrived from a retired schoolteacher in the north of England who wrote simply that she had spent 40 years in a room full of children who tested her authority daily, and that the hardest lesson she ever learned was the difference between the respect that comes from a title and the respect that must be rebuilt after one is taken away. The letter was delivered to Camilla's private secretary and placed on her desk without comment. She read it 3 times and kept it. Anne received correspondence of a different kind. Former military colleagues wrote to express confidence. Senior officials sent formal notes of welcome. A handful of palace veterans, those who had served across multiple reigns, sent private letters describing what the role would demand in seasons to come. She read each one carefully and responded to none until she had attended her first full week of duties. Only then, having formed her own understanding of the position's weight, did she begin to reply, and her responses carried the same direct and unsentimental clarity that had defined her public service for decades. Charles continued to visit Camilla privately. He did not announce these visits, and the palace did not confirm them when asked. But those within the inner circle knew they were happening, because the king arrived at certain engagements with an expression that could only be described as the specific tiredness of a man who has spoken honestly to someone he loves and found that honesty, however necessary, does not heal quickly. He carried that tiredness with a dignity that his closest staff recognised as perhaps the most genuinely royal thing about him. Not the ceremony, not the authority, but the capacity to bear an impossible personal cost without transferring it to those around him. The investigation concluded formally 6 weeks after the announcement. Its findings were distributed to senior officials, but not published in full. A decision that drew criticism from those who believed transparency demanded complete disclosure and quiet approval from those who understood that certain truths, once made fully public, cannot be contained and do no further good once the damage they describe has already been addressed. The suspended advisor departed quietly. The junior staff were reinstated. The transition framework was rewritten under William's direct supervision, with Anne's office included in the review to ensure that no single voice, regardless of title or relationship to the sovereign, could again shape the future of the crown without oversight. What remained, after the orders had been signed and the investigation closed and the public debate had shifted toward newer headlines, was something the palace had not anticipated and could not manage. A silence between 3 people who had each surrendered something they could not recover, and who now carried the shared knowledge that the institution they served demanded exactly that kind of sacrifice, and offered nothing in return except the fragile and impermanent conviction that it had been worth making. Anne said nothing publicly about the personal cost of her appointment. She was not asked, and she would not have answered if she had been. But those who attended the private dinner held at the close of the investigation, a small gathering of senior family members with no press, no staff beyond those necessary, and no official record, noted that at one point during the evening, Anne and Camilla sat beside each other for nearly 20 minutes and spoke in a register too quiet for anyone nearby to hear. No one approached them. No one would later claim to know what was said. But both women left the table with an expression that those present would describe, in later private conversations, as something between exhaustion and understanding. The crown endured. That was the only verdict the palace would ever formally deliver, And it was, as such verdicts always are, both entirely true and profoundly incomplete. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.